All right, so we are on the third installment, I guess you could call it, of the childhood vaccine study. As I've said in the past two videos, the links to every study, everything that I am going to reference is going to be in the description so that you can go look at the information yourself. And as I said, if you're just stumbling upon this video, go watch part 1 and part 2 so that you can kind of follow if I reference something from a previous conversation or topic. So the next one we're going to discuss is MMR. So the MMR vaccine is a highly controversial vaccine for several reasons. Many parents have claimed that this is the vaccine that gave their child autism. That includes Jenny McCarthy, which we referenced previously when she started talking many years ago. She was kind of pioneering some of this, as far as celebrities especially, regarding the MMR vaccine. Now, according to basically any research that you can do or any resources that you'll find medically, they will tell you the MMR vaccine does not cause autism, okay? Let's be clear, okay? Some people get this vaccine and they have no reaction whatsoever. But some may have very intense reactions. My question is, if measles, mumps, and rubella pose the risk that they do, which we'll talk about, why risk your child developing autism for a vaccine that may or may not work? Okay. Now, Andrew Wakefield was a doctor, who had his license revoked after claiming to find a causal link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about Andrew, but I would encourage you to definitely look at Andrew. Nicholas Wildman is a child whose parents told 60 Minutes many years ago, but I do link the interview in the description. Their son was a completely normal child who was developing perfectly normally prior to getting his vaccination. During that 60 Minutes video, they talk about how he's much older and has developed a very progressed form of autism that has caused, basically, he's dependent upon his parents for the rest of his life. He's nonverbal, but he was progressing extremely normally. There were no setbacks. There was nothing wrong with Andrew until he went in for Nicholas. There was nothing before he went in for that MMR vaccine, okay? Now, what is the upside for parents claiming that this is what caused their child to get autism, okay? This isn't an insurance fraud type of situation. It's not somebody cutting their brake lights and causing you to run into them so they can go get money. Parents are not receiving tons of settlements for these things. So there are a few cases where that has occurred, such as what I had talked about previously with a child dying from SIDS due to a vaccine. However, people who are claiming their child has developed autism, they're not winning these cases. Medically, there's just so much evidence that points to the fact that it's not a thing. There is no upside to a parent lying about this, okay, if they were lying. There is no upside to parents claiming that their child has developed autism as a result of these vaccines. In fact, often they're ridiculed, that they have family members that don't like them, community members. The entire internet will claim that they are full of shiitake, okay? So there is no upside to a parent claiming that their child has had a reaction to these vaccines, specifically when their child develops autism, okay? I'm also going to say there was no upside for Andrew Wakefield claiming that he had found a causal link between the MMR vaccine and autism. He lost his license, he left his home country, and has stood by what he said, even now. There was no upside to him claiming this. For years and years of going to college to become a doctor, there was no upside for Andrew claiming this, okay? They are, Big Pharma, the Western medicine conglomerate that is, tries very hard to shut up any experts, any doctors, any medical professionals who have claimed to find links. And there is no upside to parents talking about this, and most of them are ostracized by their communities, by their friends, by the internet. So I just want you to think about that before you're like, they're lying. What is the upside to them telling their story? Like, well, what would their benefit be if it is a lie? Okay, the Autism Community in Action has a chart that, per CDC reports, called the Autism and Developmental, so they have this chart called the Autism and Development Disabilities Monitoring Network, okay, and that chart shows that autism prevalence has increased by 317% since 2000. So in 1970, there was one autism diagnosis per 10,000 people. In 1995, it was 1 per 1,000 people. In 2000, it was 1 per 150 people. And by 2010, it was 1 per 68. That only increases once we hit 2020, where there's one person diagnosed for autism per 36 people. So in 1970, we went from 1 per 10,000 to 2020, which is 1 per 36. If we talk about the explosion of vaccines and compare those to the number of autism rates, taking into account that the majority of vaccines contain aluminum, and remembering that the brain scans of autistic individuals has shown that high levels of aluminum exist in their brains, it would seem logical to come to a conclusion that the vaccines are likely contributing to the rising rate of autism. And it seems very illogical to completely dismiss it as some kind of conspiracy. The medical field will tell you that this increase is actually, the increase of autism is actually due to them diagnosing it better, which makes me laugh because I asked my parents if they remember having autistic kids in their schools growing up, and none of them did. Now, some people may be like, well, maybe they had a specialized school, whatever, but the fact is that nobody is remembering these years of having these extremely autistic children in their schools. I hardly had autistic kids in my school. When I was going to school, I think I remember one, and I worked in elementary schools, and the number of autistic kids is astronomical. I worked in one classroom with at least 2 students in that single classroom, but within the elementary school there were like 6. I actually worked specifically, I didn't work in schools, I worked specifically with special needs students, so I worked a lot with autistic students. So it's just insane that number has exploded the way that it has. Look at your own children, how many kids are maybe in their classrooms with autistic students, and or just knowing kids that have autism. Japan banned the MMR vaccine. The Daily Mail put out an article about this, saying that they are the only developed nation to have done so. It reads, government health chiefs claim a 4-year experiment with this vaccine has had serious financial and human costs. Of the 3,969 medical compensation claims related to the vaccine in the last 30 years, a quarter has been made by those badly affected by the combined measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. It goes on to say that the triple jab was banned in Japan in 1993 after 1.8 million children had been given the 2 types of MMR vaccine, and a record number developed nonverbal meningitis and other adverse reactions. Official figures do show that there were 3 deaths, while 8 children were left with permanent handicaps, ranging from damaged hearing and blindness to loss of control of their limbs. The government reconsidered using the MMR vaccine in Japan in 1999, but decided that it was safer to keep the ban and continue using individual vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella. With that being said, I do want to make it very clear that we are speaking about the autism being linked to the MMR combined vaccine, which is the one that we use here in the US, okay? That article does continue to say an analysis of vaccinations over a 3-month period showed 1 in every 900 children were experiencing problems. This was over 2,000 times higher than what they expected that rate to be, with 1 child for every 100,000 to 200,000. The Japan ministry then switched to another MMR vaccine in 1991, but the incident was still high, with the 1 in every 1,755 children affected, and no separate record has been kept of claims involving autism. Tests on the spinal fluid of 125 children that were affected were carried out to see if the vaccine had gotten into the children's nervous system, and they found at least 1 confirmed case with 2 further suspected cases. Okay. Now, the almost demanded disclaimer here is that there is no official causal connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. The question is, why not? Why have the government and pharmaceutical companies not done these types of studies? Why continue to gaslight and pay off parents who are making these claims and having these very real-life experiences? Maybe it's because your integrity would be in question, the same way we saw it with COVID, and you would start losing money from the vaccines the parents are giving. When we looked at polio, we looked at a chart by JAMA, the Journal of American Medicine Association, and the chart is the historical comparison of morbidity and mortality for vaccine preventable diseases with vaccines licensed or recommended before 1990. And we found that under measles, well, when we looked at it, we were looking at it for polio, but as a reminder, the chart is the vaccine, the deaths and cases for that disease, and then it looks at after the vaccine what the cases and the death were, and then what that percent ratio was, or what the percent decline was post-vaccine. Okay, so we looked at this for polio. The chart also talks about measles, mumps, and rubella. Okay, so for measles on this chart, the pre-vaccine period shows 530,217 cases, which is from 1953 to 1962, and only 440 deaths. At the peak in 1958, there were 763,094 cases with 552 deaths, which is a pretty low chance of fatality. Mumps shows an even bigger jump for the numbers of deaths being small. And for mumps, we show the pre-vaccine era, where they recorded this from 1963 to 1978. They reported 162,344 cases with 39 cases of deaths. And the peak year for that in 1964, it shows 212,932 cases with 50 deaths. Okay? Rubella had the most astonishing numbers as far as deaths, being much less than you would think that they would be for them to create like this magical vaccine for it. Rubella showed 47,745 cases and 17 deaths, which were recorded from 1966 to 1969, and during the peak in 1969 it showed 24 deaths out of 488,796 cases. Okay, to put that into greater perspective, the peak of measles was in 1958, where the population was 174.8 million people, and there were 552 deaths, okay, which is a low rate of death. When we look at 1964, which was the peak of mumps outbreaks, the population was at 190.8 million, and there were 15 mumps deaths that year, which is again very low. The 24 deaths from rubella in its peak year was in 1969, when the U.S. population was 202.6 billion. So again, looking at the population, the rates were very low, but even out of the number of cases, to have hundreds of thousands of cases, and to be looking at at the most 552 deaths. It's a very low number. Now we get those population numbers just from the Bureau of the Census. I didn't necessarily link that. You can kind of just Google what the population of the world was in really any year, just to put it in perspective. Okay, so if you look at the current numbers, there's basically nothing, like we discussed, and it's likely just a matter of them changing the name and the diagnostic definitions of many of these diseases, and it's similar to what we saw with COVID and with polio. Okay, a lot of things have just changed, kind of how they diagnose it, what they call it, sort of a thing, okay? The FDA insert for MMR is one of the most expansive as far as risks. Under Section 5, which is titled Warning and Precautions, the first warning under Section 5.1 relates to febrile seizures. Now, the next vaccine I'm going to go over is the influenza vaccine, and I will talk to you about what my daughter experienced getting that vaccine. She did have a febrile seizure, and it was by far the most terrifying thing that I have ever been through as a parent. I'm not saying it is the most terrifying thing. I mean, I know parents go through a lot of terrifying things. Everything is terrifying as a parent. But it was by far the hardest thing we have experienced. Which is why what the FDA writes in the section regarding febrile seizures is infuriating to me personally. It is personally offending me, the way that they wrote this. In Section 5.1, it says, there is a risk of fever associated with febrile seizure in the first 2 weeks after immunization with MMR. For children who have experienced a previous seizure, and those with a family history of febrile seizure, there is a small increased risk of seizure following the receipt of MMR2 vaccine. The fact that they try to make febrile seizures normal pisses me off to no end. They're not normal. They're not fine. Kids shouldn't have them. Normal fevers don't cause them. It very much makes me angry that they're like, well, you could have one. It's a small risk if you've had one before. But they don't even say, hey, maybe you should evaluate whether or not you should get this vaccine. It's just, hey, this could happen. And that's really frustrating to me. But we will get into the story of what happened with my daughter, okay? Now, other sections do discuss, increased hypersensitivity to eggs, which is just an odd thing to me, particularly to anyone with previous reactions. And Section 6, with the adverse reactions, points specifically to paniculitis, atypical measles, fever, dizziness, irritability, vasculitis, pancreatitis, diarrhea, vomiting, leukocytosis, anaphylaxis, facial edema, and bronchial spasms. But they also mention arthritis, measles, inclusion, body encephalitis, polyneuritis, Guillain-Barre syndrome, febrile convulsions, afebrile convulsions or seizures, perianthesia, syncope, pneumonia, cough, rhinitis, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, rash, injection site reactions. And that is literally just a few of the things that this might cause, which is crazy to me that is the risks. And like I said, this is the mixed vaccine, so measles, mumps, and rubella. And twice it mentions different types of measles that you can get as a reaction to this vaccine. You can look up as well a lot of these syndromes and conditions, to get a better idea. I looked at a lot of them. I didn't talk about them necessarily here, just because there's a lot of different kind of syndromes that come from this, and I just think it's nice to look at those for yourself and just decide kind of what those, like I said, conditions are. And what they all entail, and the risk of your child getting them just from getting a vaccine. Most of them are permanent, they are debilitating, they are dangerous, and they are not Before the vaccine, if there are 17 deaths, if there's 20 deaths, if there's even 500 deaths from a disease, that is a very low number of deaths and a very low risk of death from getting the disease. I cannot understand risking your child developing Guillain-Barre syndrome or having seizures or paresthesia or pneumonia or Stevens-Johnson syndrome. All of these seem extremely dangerous to me and extremely risky, and the benefit does not outweigh the risk of getting these diseases, okay, in my very limited opinion. A lot of them are also very dangerous, like painful wise. Other side effects do include nerve deafness, orchitis, retinitis, your sight, your sound, your ability to function normally, and it's extremely dangerous. And another big one with the MMR vaccine is brain inflammation. These are permanent things that are altering your child. The risks are not outweighing the benefits. I do want to note that this is for measles, mumps, and rubella, and I like I said, I think one of the notes you want to take is that, again, you're trying to avoid getting measles and mumps, which are extremely deadly diseases that are just killing everybody, but one of the side effects is getting measles. That doesn't make sense to me, that if it's so dangerous, it's so deadly that you have to get this vaccine, why does it cause the thing you are trying to prevent? It just does not make sense. Now, I'm going to start this next section playing off of that idea of seizures, and talk about influenza vaccines, okay? Now, I am going to say that there are multiple flu vaccines, but specific to the study, as I said in the very beginning, I am going to discuss the flu vaccine that is given to infants who are 6 months and older, okay? Now, the brand name for this specific vaccine is Fluzone Quadrivalent. Fluzone is typically what it's referred to as. And this vaccine was initially approved in the United States in 2013. A lot of people will say, I trust the vaccines, they've been around for a very long time, but I mean, this has been around for 12 years, which isn't necessarily a super long time compared to when a lot of the other vaccines were approved, okay? Under Section 5.1 of the FDA Insert for this specific vaccine, one warning given regarding the flu vaccine pertains to Guillain-Barre syndrome, as we had talked about, which is a form of paralysis. And it states that in 1976, swine influenza vaccines were associated with an elevated risk of Guillain-Barre syndrome, or GBS. Evidence for a causal relation of GBS with the other influenza vaccines is inconclusive. If an excessive risk does exist, it is probably slightly more than one additional case per 1 million people vaccinated. Okay, so basically, there was a vaccine that increased risk of Guillain-Barre syndrome. Probably not a big risk now, but they kind of just shrug it off. But it was still a warning they felt necessary to put in this vaccine. Okay. As we've seen with previous vaccines, Section 5.1 tells us this vaccine may not protect all recipients, which anyone who has ever gotten a flu vaccine knows that that is true. The adverse reactions under Section 6 list arrhythmia, swelling, irritability, abnormal crying, malaise, drowsiness, fever, and headaches. Under Section 6.2, where the post-marketing reactions are listed, it includes thrombocytopenia, okay, anaphylaxis, ocular hyperthermia, Guillain-Barre syndrome, convulsions, febrile convulsions, mellitus, facial palsy, which is also called Bell's palsy, syncope, paresthesia, vasculitis, cough, rhinorrhea, rash, chest pain, vomiting. This is not the whole list. This is just a few of the things. Now, the ingredients listed under Section 7 of the FDA Insert include a 4-part split influenza A virus and activated strands of A, B. Okay, so the 4 influenza split viruses included in this vaccine are A, which is H1N1, A, which is H3N2, B, which is Victoria lineage, and B, the Yamagata lineage. Okay. Other ingredients are sodium phosphate, formaldehyde, and octylophenol ethoxylate. Okay, so those are the ingredients that are included in the Fluzone vaccine that they give to infants. Now, the CDC website, under a section called Febrile Seizures following childhood vaccinations, now this is not included in this insert, but the CDC website talks about it, and again, it's called Seizures following childhood vaccinations, including influenza vaccinations, and it says, some studies have detected a small increased risk of febrile seizures in young children following the flu shot in some flu seasons. In these studies, the risk of febrile seizures was increased for children 12 months to 13 months of age. Okay. This does fly somewhat in contradiction to what the National Library of Medicine and National Institute of Health says, because basically they're saying there's just a little bit more of a risk. But what the NIH says, they published an article in 2016, and it's by Mark Sawyer, Jeff Simon, and Carrie Byington. And they say that it is common to have a febrile seizure following a flu vaccine. Like, it's very normal. Now, if you want to read that entire whole article, as I did before, the PMCID is PMC 4925088, and the PMID is 277273713. I linked the study below, okay? Now, it reads in part, vaccines can cause fever, and fever in young children can lead to febrile seizures. These facts are not new. Now, of course, the article goes on to say that the risk is small and that there's no reason to really be fearful of it. But it directly links influenza vaccine to febrile seizures, okay? The CDC and the FDA in 2011, however, did note an increase in febrile seizures among those who were administered the flu vaccine. But they focus on the fact that there was no increase of these seizures above the age of 2. However, I don't know why that was supposed to make us feel better. Like, they made sure you know, hey, the risk of febrile seizures, it doesn't happen over the age of 2 when you get the flu vaccine. I am not saying that I think any time is a great time for a kid to have a seizure, but I think that it's quite a bit more dangerous for just like little babies and children to be having these seizures, especially considering their bodies are so small. Now, at the time, they did multiple studies after there was an increased report of seizures following the flu vaccine, but they did say that they also found no causal evidence, which again just means, well, it doesn't probably cause them. It just kind of happens. It's not the vaccine's fault, which is, I don't believe them, okay? ResearchGate.net compiled information from multiple studies of the potential link between the flu vaccine and febrile seizures. By December 10th of 2010, there were 43 confirmed reports of febrile seizures following the flu vaccine in babies aged 6 months to 23 months. Okay, one study showed a prevalent association between the two across Australia. Another study was performed in the US and revealed a disproportionately higher rate of febrile convulsions associated with the flu vaccine. But later in that study, it does recognize that the suspension of TIV in children under 5 in Australia was lifted when it was found that the risk of febrile convulsions was specific to vaccinations with flu vax, okay? A separate study showed that with the inactivated influenza vaccine in the United States, the risk of febrile seizures was 9 per 1,000 doses in young children. So again, those numbers are basically, they're trying to get you to see there's research that shows that this vaccine can cause these seizures, but we want you to kind of look away from that and realize the risk is small. It's not that big of a deal. We don't know if it actually is because of the vaccine. Really trying to gaslight people into not really thinking the research means much. But I will say that if legally to protect themselves, they need to put it in the FDA insert, you should be worried about it, okay? Now, although you're not likely to find concrete, stamped evidence that the influenza vaccine can cause febrile seizures, there are at least 8 reports of it happening after 15 days and before 35 days post-vaccine. Okay, there are at least 8 reports of that. Now again, is that a big number? No, not necessarily. But it is also interesting that doctors will kind of ignore it if it does happen and tell you that it's normal. So it's not always something that's reported. So for instance, with my daughter, it wasn't something that was reported. I did share with you, speaking of which, my son's story when we talked about the DTaP vaccine. So I am going to tell you about my daughter's story, okay? Now, before she was born, I had heard about the concept of people not vaccinating their children. And it certainly was interesting to me, but I didn't really take the time to research it in depth. And after she was born, I did start studying it, but I kind of assumed that since she had already been getting her vaccinations, that we could probably finish vaccinating her, I guess. And when I got pregnant with my son, we made the decision not to vaccinate him at all. And in between there was an incident that made that decision even more clear to me. Now, to give you a little bit of a history just for a minute on my daughter's vaccinations, she was born on May 12th of 2022, and she had her hepatitis vaccine, DTaP vaccines, pneumococcal vaccines, IPV, HIV, as well as some influenza vaccines. I didn't know it at the time, okay? I didn't know when it happened that it was due to a vaccination that caused Jasmine to have a seizure, okay? So on February 14th of 2023, Valentine's Day, Jasmine got her second influenza vaccine. She had been given one previously in November the year before, and she had had no reaction to the first vaccination. But on March 17th of 2023, she did have a febrile seizure, which was 123 days since she had gotten a big group of vaccines, okay? But it was only 33 days since that second vaccine. Now, according to what I had said before, according to the Vaccine Adverse Events and Reactions database, those seizures were happening within 35 days. So it was within the kind of normal, well, not the normal, but the reported window of when people were having these that were caused by the vaccine. Okay, so I was in the bath in the middle of the night. I had a 10-month-old child, first baby. I was in the bath, shaving my legs, moisturizing everything, just getting pretty, okay, for the first time in 10 months. I was just shaving my legs, shaving my armpits. You girls know what I'm talking about, okay? It was a full happy time, shower, exfoliating. I was gonna be clean. I was gonna be happy. I was gonna take a little time. So, this was in the middle of the night, okay? This was not at a normal hour of the evening. So I'm doing that, and at the time we had a bedroom with a, master bathroom. And so I'm, like I said, in this bathtub and just whatever. My parents, well, we lived with my parents at the time. I shouldn't say they lived with us. We lived with my parents at the time, because we were kind of in between transitioning to another place to live. So we're living with my parents, and I hear Jasmine kind of scream. That's my daughter's name, Jasmine. I hear her scream, but it wasn't a normal baby scream. It was like a human scream. Y'all parents know what I'm talking about. Babies don't scream, okay? They have baby screams. But Jasmine screamed, just a little scream. And I kind of rush over to the side of her playpen crib. I rush over there and I look in there, and I just kind of was like, she's kind of shaking. So I pick her up. and she's convulsing. And I've worked in healthcare before. I know what a seizure is, and I'm just like, she's having a seizure. So I yell at my husband. I'm like, baby, wake up, get up. Jasmine's having a seizure. And I start running in the hall, and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs at 1 a.m. down the stairs, Mom, get up, Jasmine's having a seizure. Okay, my husband's putting pants on. He sleeps in his boxers. I sleep with clothes on like a weirdo. Thankfully, I had just gotten dressed. I was doing some stuff with my hair, whatever. So I'm just freaking booking it. I rush down the stairs. My mom meets me at the bottom of the stairs, and I'm sitting there just holding her. I know better than to try to, restrain her, and she's just having these convulsions. And me and my mom both, we know better. We've worked in her healthcare, but we're just like, Jasmine, wake up. Jasmine, Jasmine? Nothing. We are getting nothing out of this kid. So we're holding her, kind of making sure she's not choking on her tongue or her saliva or anything like that. And for a couple of minutes that felt like far too long, we're just holding her and waiting, and she finally stops convulsing. And my mom's just looking at her, making sure she's okay. And I am just like, I have never held that baby so tightly. And I am just holding her. She's 10 months old, first baby. I am just breaking out. And so I'm holding her, I'm snuggle bugging her, I am just loving her, giving her all the kisses I have to offer. And I'm just holding her. And my husband calls 911. It was the worst night. There is no good time for your kid to have a seizure, but it was the worst night. We lived in southwestern Minnesota at the time during a massive fracking snowstorm, of course. So 911 is like, hey, we're gonna get there, but it's gonna be a minute. So police car rolls up, knocks on the door. Didn't come up to the door, it was down the street a little. Anyway, they knock on the door. Husband answers the door. He's not focused on nothing besides my daughter. So they said, hey, did you call 911? And he goes, no, we're fine. And we're like, no, we're not. And he's like, oh, my bad. His brain just was all over the place. And so we let the officers in, and they started evaluating her. And they said, all right, there's a snowplow, okay, leading the ambulance here, but it'll be a few more minutes. And so he said, why don't you come sit in my car and, just warm her up and whatever, because they had to park about 500-ish feet. I have no concept of distance, but approximately 500 feet. There's a house next to ours, and then an alley right there, where we lived in Minnesota. And so we had to run from our house past the other house to the alley, okay, about 500 feet. So we're running over there. I'm just snuggling her. I got a big blanket around her. I wasn't thinking about my choice in footwear, so I threw on Crocs, and I'm running through the snow, and my shoes fall off, and I don't give a shit. And so I'm holding her, and we get to the police car, and I'm just wrapping her up. He's got the heater going. We're just sitting there, and the ambulance finally pulls up. And so we go get in the ambulance, and they start evaluating her. Okay, my parents couldn't get out of the driveway due to all of the snow, and so they can't get out of the driveway, and they get stuck. So the ambulance takes us, and they start evaluating her. And the doctor's pissing me off because she's like, how do you know for sure she had a seizure? And I'm like, because I'm not an idiot. And so I'm holding her, and they finished evaluating her. There's not a lot that they could do. They couldn't tell you, what kind of seizure, whatever. They just said it's probably a febrile seizure. She had been having seizures all day, jumping massively up and down. And so, they release us the same night. We go into one of their little rooms because we didn't have a ride home, and we stayed the night at the hospital. I don't think I slept more than 5 minutes that night. I just kept staring at her. I was so terrified, and so I'm holding her and just snuggling her. And, my parents were able to come pick us up, and all was well. But for a week, I did nothing but stare at her, and if I did fall asleep, I would jerk awake when I did wake up and beat myself up for falling asleep and not watching her. And so it was a long week of being terrified for my daughter's life. And it was like a week after that we found out we were pregnant with our second child, which was really shitty timing because I was like, I'm not doing this again. And so we looked at her, and thankfully she was fine, but to this day, my son has never had a seizure, and he won't because he doesn't get vaccines. But I don't worry about him if he rustles around in his sleep. To this day, this was 2 years ago, and to this day, I stare at my daughter when she's sleeping. I cannot. Like, if she moves funny in her sleep, I know. And I watch her, and it scares me. So I, you know, when we started studying this enough and looking into the vaccines, and I realized that it absolutely was the influenza vaccine that caused her to have this febrile seizure, it was absolutely the easiest decision to not vaccinate our kids. Now, because that's not technically proven, cue the eye roll. The biggest risk that I think has been proven in connection with the influenza vaccine is the Guillain-Barre syndrome issue. We've discussed this a few times, but I'm going to explain exactly what Guillain-Barre syndrome is. It is a rare autoimmune disorder that can cause the immune system to attack the peripheral nerves, which can lead to sudden muscle weakness and numbness. A study performed by the National Library of Medicine shows in Table 2 of this section that a total of 20 out of 139 individuals got diagnosed with Guillain-Barre syndrome within 30 days following vaccination of the influenza vaccine, and 119 remaining individuals did not. That is a 14.3885% chance of getting Guillain-Barre syndrome from the vaccine. The medical field will tell you that it is an extremely low risk, but Guillain-Barre syndrome is a very serious condition, and risking that versus your child simply getting the flu, I think the risk outweighs the benefit, friends. So that one's a very passionate topic, I should say, to me, in case you were unable to tell. Now, we are going to discuss RSV. Now, I learned that there was a new RSV vaccine in 2023 when my son was born, and the vaccine is called Preventable, which is the brand name, and was approved in the United States in 2023. It is approved for babies from birth until 6 months old, and for pregnant mothers as well from 32 to 36 weeks. Under Section 1.1 of the FDA Insert, it specifically says that for pregnant women, it can prevent lower respiratory tract diseases, and that it prevents respiratory, I don't know how to say this, but respiratory syncytial virus in infants, which is RSV. Section 1.2 and 1.1 of the FDA Insert expand on the use of the vaccine, which is now for people who are age 60 and older as well, but it can also be used for those 18 to 59 who are at risk of developing RSV. So this has greatly been expanded, even though it just came out 2 years ago. So, you know, it's used for infants and people age 60 and older, but now it's also been expanded for anyone at risk from age 18 to 59. Section 5.1 of the FDA Insert specifically lists Guillain-Barre syndrome as a potential risk and says that the results of a post-marketing observational study suggest that there is an increased risk of Guillain-Barre syndrome during the 42 days following vaccination with Preventable. Section 5.2 lists the risks of preterm birth as a result of receiving Preventable while pregnant, and Section 5.4 plainly states that you could faint upon receiving this vaccine, which is a condition known as syncope, or syncope, however I've pronounced it. I'm sure I pronounced it 3 different ways during the course of these videos. So, Section 6 for the RSV vaccine specifically goes into the adverse reactions. For pregnant women, the reactions may include headache, muscle pain, nausea, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, joint pain, preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, premature rupturing of the membranes, which is your water breaking, hypertension, fetal death, and then there's at least one case of the mother dying upon receiving the RSV vaccine. The FDA Insert does clearly state that this study for the mothers of pregnant women who are having babies and get the RSV vaccine, that the study from that group is still ongoing. Okay, they don't know all of the risks. Now, for infants, the adverse reactions include low birth weight, neonatal jaundice, and there were 10 infant deaths out of the 3,568 of Breezeville recipients, and there were also high risk of preterm birth. There was also no study done to determine the risk of infants who were breastfed by mothers who received this vaccine, and the FDA states in section 8.2 that it is not known whether Breezeville is excreted in human milk, meaning that you could still kind of be passing along this to your baby, even after they're born. So what is RSV? What are its symptoms? What are the risks, right? RSV stands for respiratory syncytial virus. It's a virus that can cause infection of the respiratory tract. Severe RSV in infants can cause short, shallow, and rapid breathing, struggling to breathe, cough, poor feeding, irritability, bronchitis, pneumonia, wheezing, cyanosis, asthma, and middle ear infections. The serious cases of RSV that are like the worst cases can lead to hospitalization, while mild RSV in infants can cause a runny nose, congestion, sore throat, cough, fatigue, and headaches. Now, treatment for mild RSV can include fever management, hydration, rest, nasal suctioning, nasal drops, humidifiers, and monitoring. Severe RSV is typically treated with hospitalization, IV treatments, oxygen therapy, ventilation, or antiviral medications. Now, as I kind of said, to be clear, this can also affect people who are age 60 and older, but obviously we're specifically studying and looking into the children who get RSV. Many infants do get RSV, okay, but let's look at how many are really getting it, what the hospitalization rates are, what the death rates are, okay? Now, according to the CDC, there's 58,000 to 80,000 children from the age 0 to 5 years old who are hospitalized due to RSV every year in the United States. They also say that 2 to 3 out of every 100 children under 6 months old are hospitalized every year due to RSV. They do tell us that the support care in the hospitals works and that most infants are discharged even with severe RSV within a few days. Medicine Net looked at the mortality rates and tells us that 0.5 to 1.7% of healthy children may die of RSV, while infants with suppressed immunity face a major jump. It's about a 60% chance of mortality. You are likely to get a wide variety of answers when you look into death numbers. This is a very mysterious vaccine, given that it was also just created 2 years ago. The Cleveland Clinic tells us that around the world, 3 million children are hospitalized with RSV every year, and over 100,000 of them die. They do admit that those numbers are much higher in poverty-stricken nations, so that's a worldwide number, right? But the CDC is telling us that 100 to 300 children die of RSV in the U.S. every year. The U.S. cases, like I said, are 58,000 to 80,000, and they're talking 100 to 300 deaths each year. If we look at those numbers and take them at complete face value, your risk of getting RSV and then dying from it in the United States as an infant is pretty low. Very low. In 2022, the population of children from age 0 to 5 years old was 22,000. Nope, not 22,000. It's 22.53 million, okay? 22 million children. If we say that even at the higher end, or the lower end, I suppose, at 300 children dying of RSV, that would have given you a 0.0013% chance of dying from it, okay? Which is a pretty low chance. Now, if we take those numbers and we, kind of start to break them up into different years, the National Library of Medicine tells us that approximately 2,000 children are hospitalized with RSV, and that was from 2021 to 2022. And then from the 22 to 23 RSV season, they saw 4,977 hospitalizations. Now, in 2022, in Ontario, Canada, they faced an RSV pandemic of sorts. and they still only saw less than 5 RSV deaths. Now, another study that was published based on the NVSN, which is the New Vaccine Surveillance Network, they looked at 2016 to 2022, or I'm sorry, 2016 to 2020, and then they looked at 2021 and then 2022, okay? So they looked at those 3 groups, but multiple years. Now, in 2016 to 2022, they had 879 children go to the ICU for RSV in the United States, okay? There were 1,535 children that stayed 0 to 1 days in the hospital. 1,045 of those children stayed 2 days. 916 stayed for 3 to 4 days, and 747 stayed for 5 or more days. The specific study recorded 0 deaths in that time from 2016 to 2020 from RSV. Okay. 2021, we had 291 ICU visits, 450 children stayed 0 to 1 days, 331 stayed for 2 days, 298 stayed for 3 to 4 days, and 199 were there for 5 or more days. There was only 1 death reported that year from RSV. In 2022, they recorded 337 ICU visits, 474 stayed 0 to 1 days, 338 stayed 2 days, 376 stayed for 3 or more days, and 297 stayed for 5 or more days. But again, 0 deaths were reported. Okay? That does not make any sense. How are they going to say that there are 300 to 500 RSV deaths a year, but the National Library of Medicine and the National Institute of Health are reporting 1 death, okay, and from 2016 to 2022. There was 1 RSV confirmed death. Okay? Now, academia.oup.com, which I linked below, they studied 1,213 deaths of infants through multiple countries, okay? Now, RSV was detected after death in 67 of the infants, and 24 were determined to be exactly caused by RSV. 5 deaths had RSV as a contributing factor to their death, okay? So not necessarily cause, but it was definitely contributing to it. Birth defects and infections were common causes of death during that time or during that study, partnered with the RSV. These reports came from CHAMPS, which is the Child Health and Mortality Prevention Surveillance, and it is unclear what time frame or how many years that study covered. And according to that CHAMPS study, most of the deaths were not even in the United States, okay? Bangladesh had 0 of the RSV deaths, but 2 RSV contributing deaths. Ethiopia had 1 RSV death and 3 RSV contributing deaths. Kenya had 4 RSV deaths and 18 RSV contributing deaths. Mali had 4 RSV deaths with 10 RSV contributing deaths. And then South Africa had the highest with 15 RSV deaths and 24 RSV contributing deaths. But somehow the U.S. is having 300 to 500. Okay, how is South Africa going to have 15 RSV deaths, and we're having 300 to 500? It doesn't seem probable. Okay, and this is talking about deaths. This is not talking about cases. There are tons of cases of RSV in the United States every year and around the world. But this is talking specifically about deaths. The CDC website did list in 2022 their top 10 causes of deaths for infants, and RSV was not listed, although respiratory distress of newborns was listed. And in 2021, that caused 413 deaths and 458 deaths in 2022. Okay? In conclusion, finding information about RSV deaths is very much a struggle, but the numbers we do see are pointing to the fact that they are 100% lying to you about the RSV deaths. Okay? None of this is to say that your kids will not get sick. Okay? Your kids will probably get sick if you have them. But, we are seeing, for us specifically, my son is 20 times healthier than my daughter was at his age. Astronomically healthier. He has not had anything besides fevers and a cold. And my daughter had to be on a nebulizer at the hospital at one point from pneumonia and breathing issues. She has had to be to the ER a couple of times for, severe vomiting, severe fevers, obviously a febrile seizure. And my son just is normal. He gets a cold that lasts him a day or two, and he takes a nap and sleeps it off. So, again, I don't want to judge any parent who vaccinates their children, and I do not believe in sitting and stewing about the what ifs. I just want to share the information that might help save your child from the same distress and torment that parents have been facing for years, because their child has had a massive reaction to a vaccine. But I also want to give parents the tools and resources to present confidently if they choose not to vaccinate their child. I want you to be able to walk into a doctor's office and say, hold the phone, I know what I'm talking about, chill out, I'm not getting this vaccine, and to be able to prevent medically sound information. I believe that, these resources and this information does have the ability to give you the power to do that and to walk in confidently. That's it for this one. I'm going to go ahead and carry it into a fourth. I wasn't sure if that was going to happen or not. And there are a couple last topics that are not necessarily vaccine oriented. We're going to talk about induction, birth control, go over some of my personal case studies, if you will. And I appreciate you checking out this video. I'll see you in a minute.